if you want to be noticed in climate, you have to continually spout, nonsense. I get routine death threats, not just to me, but to my family. So climate is really the only important societal effort that's never had a red team.
My guest again today is Will Happer. And Will, thank you so much for doing this. What do you think is happening with Trump coming in now? Do you have any views on the big picture of are we going to get more sanity in the various departments?
Well, I think Mr. Trump has the right instincts. The government has gotten too big, the administrative state, and that happens to all governments. It's a eternal problem, in human history. And I think he learned from his first term that he underestimated the power of the administrative state. And so you can see from the appointments he's making now that he's hoping to get that under control. We'll see how well that works. Our system of government is designed to share power between Congress and the executive branch. And, the administrative state, in theory, reports to the president, but in reality, most of them report to Congress. And so it's a question of how powerful their daddy rabbits in the Congress are, as Mr. Trump sets forth to bring some sanity to this organization. So anyway, fingers crossed. Let's see how well he does.
So I listened to you on other podcasts. You had some fascinating stuff to say about what it was like when you were working with Bush the first, where you would have people come in from various scientists would come in and explain what they were doing. Do you think that's going to happen now, that somebody, maybe Gavin Schmidt or these alarmist scientists will have to come in and explain themselves to somebody in this Trump administration? I hope that happens.
I hope it happens too. It would be a very good idea. And, it's something that the leadership of, NASA, NOAA, Department of Energy should have been doing all along, but they haven't been doing it properly. They haven't been insisting on quality. I think it's not too bad in fields that aren't political. So, for example, I think the work on how to say theoretical physics is okay. It's not a lot of money, but some of it may be wrong, but it's honest. And the closer it gets to political things where lots of money's involved, the less honest it becomes. And so, if you're a good program manager, you can figure that out.
So you were talking about even back in the 1990s when you had the scientists come in, that there was something different about the climate scientists, that they were defensive. And when you asked them, how did you calibrate this? They maybe took offense at it, or they handled it differently, right?
Yes, that's right. They were different from high energy physicists or, human genome warriors or, deep drillers looking for underground life. All of these other people were excited about what they were doing just for its own sake. It was exciting. And the climate people, I think some of them were excited about climate, but many of them were mostly worried about next year's funding, and how well they looked to Mr. Gore and the various people who had been promoting this new science. And so that's only gotten worse since then. It's much worse now than it was back then. Fusion was a little bit that way, controlled fusion. Again, it was big promises, potentially very important to society as a source of energy. But it was clearly very, very hard back then, and it hasn't gotten easier today. So I was always sympathetic to both the climate and fusion people. I thought it was important. It was important science, and we had to have good people working on it, but I didn't like the way it had been politicized.
So Do you have a sense this time around how much science literacy there is among the people in Trump's department? Or do you think they'll be advised by people who do understand the issues with climate?
I'm encouraged about the new Secretary of Energy nominee, Mr. Wright. I think I've never met him personally, but everything I hear about him and things I've read that he wrote are very sensible. But, he's too high up to make a difference. So it will really depend on his assistant secretaries, his deputy secretaries. And so those are very important appointments that are yet to be made. And so the advice I give to my friends is look at the second tier. That's where the front lines are. And if they don't get good people there, then it doesn't matter if you've got a good secretary of the department, his orders won't get implemented.
Okay, that's
well, there's a famous joke they tell about secretaries coming in. This one has to do with the Secretary of the Navy, but maybe I've told it on this program before, but the Secretary of Navy shows up. He's just been appointed. He's been approved by the Senate, and he has a young captain who's his aide who wanders around with him in the Pentagon and sits outside his office door and is a gatekeeper. And so the first year goes pretty well. They get a lot done. And they're sitting at a bar finally. They've gotten to know each other well enough they can afford to drink a beer together. And the captain has a little much to drink and too much to drink. He says to the secretary, Mr. Secretary, you're the third Secretary of the Navy that I have watched over, and you're about the best yet. And he says, the way we do it, we take them up to the bridge and we put them in the steering wheel and we let him turn the wheel to the right and to the left and full steam ahead. And if he does real well after 2 or 3 years, we attach the wheel to the rudder. Yep. And so that's the way it works, and you really can't expect. And Mr. Trump didn't understand that, as well as he should have. I think he sort of understood it, but he didn't realize how true the story is. Yeah.
Okay, so that is very interesting insight. I did not know that. So people call it the deep state. Do you think that could be applied at these second level people and on down? Maybe they're part of the deep state and they stay around?
It's easy for them to go native, as they say, and to be captured by the deep state. Yeah. So those people have to have very strong personalities. They have to be committed. They have to consider this a temporary job that is not supposed to be a lifetime job. They do a good job and then they go back to whatever they were doing before. It's different from being a civil servant where you join the government and you retire on a pension, at whatever the retirement age is. These leadership positions shouldn't be like that. They should be getting a job done efficiently, for the American people. And so they're different kinds of jobs.
So as these different names of nominees came out, I would go on Twitter and just search them for climate and to see what did they say about climate. And time again, I saw them saying reasonable things about there's no climate crisis, et cetera. So that makes me happy. Do you have any ideas of who should be in these second level positions? Like you're not nominating yourself this year to do this, or who else? Like David
I'm
Legate?
85 years old. I'm too old for this kind of stuff. But it's hard to find people because we've had 30 years of a reign of terror in climate science. And so for climate, at least, there aren't very many good people out there. There are a few, but they're hard to find. And so I'm quite worried about the second level, just finding the people.
So are you thinking that for the good of the country, some potential second level people should step forward and say, I'm willing to go to Washington and do this for a couple of years at least? You'd like to see that, I guess?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So if there are, and I know those people are out there, but as I said, they're hard to find. Some of them are good because they've kept a low profile. And if you want to be noticed in climate, you have to continually spout nonsense, and so people know about you, but it's just not very not very reassuring. If you look at the record. I think, for example, it might be a good idea to bring in people from other fields to the climate area, because the other fields have not suffered this dearth of integrity that has been such a problem for climate. I mean, there are good people. First, let me be clear. I think the people in climate who are running measurement programs are often quite good. The people who manage satellite measurements or ground-based measurement, the ARM program measurements, many of those people are, we should be proud of. They're doing a good job. But they don't tend to be the type that's selected. The people who rise to the attention, of the cabinet secretaries are those who've been in the newspapers and have published op-eds, and very few of the really competent people have done that. So that's something you can take care of, if you're aware of the problem.
So do you get the sense that there are these good people doing the measurements, et cetera, and they're just not sticking their neck out? Privately, they know there's no climate crisis, and they know CO2 isn't the climate control knob, but it hasn't been good for their career to come out and strongly say that.
A few have come out strongly, whom I'm sure you know. For example, John Christie and Roy Spencer at University of Alabama, Huntsville are very good. John Christie would be super, at one of these assistant secretary jobs, or presidential science advisor or something like that. But there are not many people like that.
So it's come at great personal cost to some of these people, though, right? Weren't there actual bullets fired through the office window of either Christie or Spencer during some environmental march? I just heard something about that, bullets through a window, that tends to make people not want to stick their necks out.
Well, yeah, there was a somebody did shoot up John Christie's office during one of these demonstrations in Huntsville. And, I get routine death threats, not just to me, but to my family, so you have to be pretty strong-willed, to put your head up in this area.
I mean, you said, do you think even to this day, if you were 30 years old, just starting out, it would be a lot tougher to speak as with the candor that you're speaking now, right? That's probably true.
Well, I have the advantage that I'm not really a climate scientist. I've worked with lasers, I'm best known for my work on adaptive optics. And so it's areas that are related to climate, but they didn't depend on climate, for their funding and for their interests. So I never had to face that. I'm grateful for that, but I think it was useful for me because I knew a lot more about climate than most climate scientists, because the things I worked on every one of them was related to climate in one way or another.
Are you optimistic that the field of climate science itself can recover, or we've just turned out decades of people who are kind of all into it from the start? Do you think that sanity within that field can come back, or the sanity is going to come from the outside, not from these armies of climate scientists?
Well, I think it will come back, but it's a little bit like what happened to biology in the Soviet Union under Lysenko. There was 30-odd years of, suppression of real biology, and just the field was completely corrupted by phonies, supported first by Stalin and then by Khrushchev. And the Soviet biologists have recovered, but it's been very difficult. It took decades for them to recover. But there are a lot of good biologists again in the Soviet Union, so we will recover too in climate. But and some of the people that are already there are good. And so just giving them a little bit more freedom to speak out and to, educate students and postdocs, that will be very useful.
Do you see any hope this time around for any actual formal red team versus blue team? I would love that if that could happen.
Well, I hope it will happen. That's been pushed for many, many years without success. And during the first Trump administration, Mr. Trump himself thought it was a good idea and was enthusiastic, but his advisors didn't want to do it. Well, you'll have different advisors this time, and fingers crossed, let's hope that they'll be willing this time to do it. It's completely necessary. I keep telling people, we never build a big weapon system, a new fighter plane or a new submarine without very harsh red team reviews, and more than one, and they're extremely useful because no matter how smart you are, if it's your baby and you're trying to promote it, there are lots of flaws that you just can't see. So you need a knowledgeable opponent to come in and ask your questions. And if you don't do that, you produce a piece of junk, that has all sorts of flaws, and you've spent a lot of money. And that's what we've done on climate. Yeah, it's never had this necessary review. It's and the way they have suppressed, criticism is disgraceful. It reminds me, they talk about, 90% consensus, 99% consensus that, there's a climate crisis. Well, of course, that's complete nonsense. That's because they've killed off anyone who would question this. It's, there's this famous passage in, I guess, Tacitus or one of the Roman historians about Calgacus, the head of the Scottish, the last stand against the Roman in Scotland. His name was Calgacus. And Calgacus gave a speech to his motley crew who was hoping to resist the Roman incursions into Scotland, and said, the Romans, their mode of operation is that they kill off all the opposition, and they call it peace, and they make a desert and they call it peace. I wish I could say it in Latin, but you can look it up, Calgacus. And that's what the climate community has done. So it's an ancient trick. It actually works. If you kill all your opposition, there's no opposition.
So I did not know that has been a formal thing to use red teams elsewhere in the federal government even?
Oh, yeah, very common. Even the CIA had a red team, review. I've forgotten what they called it, but it was essentially a red team review. It was many years ago. And so climate is really the only important societal effort that's never had a red team.
Well, I do wonder if people might be more open to the whole red team thing, just given what happened with COVID. Just among the people around me, I find so many people waking up and asking questions now and not just blindly believing what they were told. I see so much of that. Do you see that too? Any change where people are more open to questions?
Yeah, I think COVID has helped. And because it was just obvious that there were official lies being told all the time. And I'm encouraged by the people that Mr. Trump has appointed in areas related to COVID. I hope that some truth begins to come out about what happened there. Bhattacharya, for example, at NIH, that's a great appointment.
So you mentioned, again, in the past that you were kind of fired by Al Gore, even though you didn't work for Al Gore. And other scientists, when you asked them to come in, they said, I don't know, I got to ask Al Gore. So Gore had some sort of power back then. Does he have that power, or do senators still have that power now? They think they have this power where they can fire people? I don't understand how that could ever happen.
Well, with Al Gore, that was after Clinton had won the election against Bush Sr. And so Gore was vice president, and he had every right to appoint his own people. I was a political appointee, and I was actually quite grateful to be fired. I stayed a few months longer than normal. Most people had submitted their letters of resignation. I did too, but they asked me to stay on. And so it's perfectly okay to be fired in that kind of position. It's not okay to be fired if you're a civil servant. That's quite different. You're not supposed to be political. You're supposed to be, doing non-political services to your country. It might be science, it might be getting out Social Security checks, whatever it is, collecting taxes. Those people are simply doing an honest job that isn't a political job. But I was doing a political job. It was a quasi-political job at the very least.
All right. I mean, do you think senators now then have any power, like Sheldon Whitehouse or these warmest senators? Are they exerting any sort of federal power?
Well, they will exert every effort they can to prevent confirmation of the cabinet appointees and lower level appointees. So the Senate, has this power of advice and consent. So when Mr. Trump nominates someone for a job, it has to go to the Senate. At a certain level, the Senate has to approve it. And so any senator can object, and they do. And often the objections really aren't personal to the nominee. It's because they're trying to get some bridge built in their home district, or, and this is the price. You want my vote for this nominee? Make sure the money comes my way. Right? So that's traditional. I it's not great, but I can live with that.
Do you have any comments on the role of the legacy media now versus 30 years ago? It seems to me maybe the New York Times, maybe senators, politicians were listening to the New York Times more then than now. And as the legacy media goes away, does that give you any hope that the sanity will return for this whole climate thing?
Well, the media is a problem because they, they're a sounding board for this corrupt elite. And again, let me be clear that not all scientists are corrupt, but there are certainly some of them who are. And their voices are amplified by the New York Times and the Washington Post and even the Wall Street Journal. And so there's I think the lesson of this last election is that all of the mainstream media, legacy media, was clearly against Trump, but it didn't matter. He won anyway. It may even have helped him a little bit. It's hard to know. So I think the legacy media in climate is a disgrace. I think many of your listeners will have seen what happened at the Scientific American, which went south a number of years ago. But it just was outrageous the last 2 or 3 years with science and with COVID and, any issue. It was no longer science. It was, political propaganda, or extreme left-wing causes. So we'll see whether they can dig themselves out of that, and win the respect of people who used to respect them again.
I think you've said elsewhere that the average scientist probably doesn't know more about climate than random people like me who have just dug into it on their own. Do you think that's true, that there's still an enormous amount of groupthink and the number of scientists who've actually taken the time to dig in is pretty small worldwide?
Oh, yeah. It's sort of, it's herd mentality, in the scientific community. Scientists have always felt that they deserve more respect than they get, and so when one of their community is attacked, their natural instinct is to defend them, because it's like you yourself are under attack. And so sometimes when scientists are attacked, they deserve to be attacked, And so that's when scientists really should try and back off and understand what's the cause of the hostility to this particular branch of science. And but our community hasn't done that very well. Certainly if I walk around, my department of physics at Princeton is a very good department of physics, and none of my colleagues has ever done anything wrong to me. They've all been quite courteous, but none of them really know very much about climate, even the most basic things, fluid dynamics. If you spent your career working on heterotic strings, you don't know very much about, the key physics of climate, which is radiation transfer, fluid motions and stuff like that. And the people who I guess should know it most are the astrophysicists. But again, that has drifted so much toward things like cosmology, which have very little overlap with the physics of climate, or to, a star has some similarities. You have a lot of radiation transfer in stars, and you have convection in stars, but, it's not all that similar, because, in a star, you don't have molecules. It's too hot. And so all of your natural instincts in a star are not very helpful. In many cases, they're harmful to understanding climate, because you get the wrong idea, because it's different physics in a star. So, just because a scientist says, I support climate science, it doesn't mean that he knows more than your listener does. Your listener probably knows more than he does in many cases. This reminds me of, there's something I'm sure you've heard of called Gell-Mann amnesia. But Gell-Mann was a famous physicist in Caltech. He's the one who named quarks, and he once pointed out that he had read an article in the New York Times a week ago, and it was about his field of physics, and it was just completely wrong from beginning to end. Everything was wrong about it, even cause and effect were all messed up. And he said, then I turned the page and I started reading about foreign relations, and I believed everything I read. And he said, then I stopped for a minute and I began to think, is it possible that all these other topics, it's also nonsense? Right? And so that's that's operating big time with climate. That you read these sober, sensible sounding articles, op-eds and things, and but in fact, it's all nonsense. Because nobody's really dug into what is the real truth. It's what does everybody else think? What do the people that I respect think, and who will affect my status in society? What do they think? And I have to be careful not to offend them. So, so that's a force that's always been a problem for humanity. It's still true today. I guess it will be true forever.
Like I mentioned, I think that is maybe the single biggest question that's come up recently is, what else are they lying to us about? I love the fact that so many people are asking that question.
Yeah,
I wanted to go back to your commentary on Princeton, that you've been able to speak out publicly and, politically incorrect, but still you can go about your life at Princeton, go to your office, and people treat you with respect still. It's not like you're a horrible guy for what you've been saying.
No.
Yeah, that's great. That makes me happy.
Yeah, they've been very good. I mean, I'm disappointed that Princeton has invested so much money in this nonsense, but in doing that, they have been courteous to me. So I guess I shouldn't complain.
Would you still say that's kind of the zeitgeist at Princeton, that there is a climate crisis and we have to do everything we can to fight CO2? Does it go that far?
Princeton is jumped into the climate religion with all its all of its resources. So if you walk around the campus, you read about sustainability and, buildings, and we've burrowed out the ground under our feet for geothermal heat exchange, and we've covered once green fields of soybeans with solar panels. So we've done it all, and we'll regret it at some point, may probably after I'm gone, but we've caused, I think, a lot of damage that future Princetonians will have to repair.
One thing that both you and Richard Lindzen have done a really good job at is talking about that highly educated people are easier to fool on the whole climate thing. You talked about your barber or people who have real jobs in the real world. They don't trust the models, or they trust their eyes more than academics do. And you said something about in the Cultural Revolution, I think Mao had the elites go out and live like an ordinary person for a while. And you think maybe that's one thing that they got right with that revolution? Do you have any more to talk about there about the ordinary people not being fooled?
Well, I think Dick Lindzen has been much more eloquent than I have about this, and he's written several very nice articles recently, which I recommend. I don't have a link to them right now, but if you've been sort of an A student all your life, teacher's pet, and you've come to Princeton or Harvard or Stanford, you've really been detached from reality. You've never really had to see how the world works. You've gotten top scores on exams and praise, and but you know very little about, for example, how does the automobile work really, and how is your food grown, and how does it get from the farm to where you buy it, and where does the electricity come from, and why is it that it's there most of the time and you don't have blackouts like they do much of the rest of the world? All of that is completely foreign. And so if you had sometime in your youth spent a year or two in a practical situation on a farm or in a power plant or, in a trucking firm, I think you would be a much more effective citizen. And, I wouldn't recommend doing it in the harsh way that Mao did, but the basic idea, I think, was good. And we did much the same thing with the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps was supposed to give young people a chance to do something useful. And in many cases, I think it was. They went off and they taught English, and that was useful to their students in Africa or some other place, and it helped them to get ahead. I never thought that teaching Africans how to bake bread with solar ovens made much sense, but that was something the Peace Corps promoted, which was just nonsense, and I think that gave the Peace Corps a very bad name. But some of the other things they did made sense. So anyway, something to give young people practical experience. It was clearly a good idea. And I think something to give young people some pride, some reason for living, something to, why am I living? What can I do useful in my life so my life is worthwhile? I think we've failed young people in that way. We've made it very difficult for many young people to feel that they're doing something useful, that they deserve respect because they're useful to society and to themselves. So lots of people have pointed this out. I don't know how to fix it. It's people have tried in one way or another, but I think we should keep trying. And
So I don't know if you want to drop any names. I would love it if you would drop some names that you've, in your career, you've rubbed shoulders and hung out with people like Freeman Dyson, right? You've spent time with high-powered, famous scientists. Do you have any observations of what you've learned from them? Or one particular thing is, do you think did they have any connection with the real world? Do you think that it's even for a high-powered scientist, should they have done some, even farming or had real jobs in the outside? At that very highest level, maybe they can, they don't have to have that practical experience?
Well, Freeman Dyson, grew up in World War II. So even before he got his university degrees, he had been facing German bombing. He had been in the British RAF, planning raids over Germany. My Scottish cousin, flew Lancaster bombers over Germany during that time. And I was a kid in World War II, Oak Ridge, where my mother was the first doctor. And so that generation was almost forced to have practical experience. It was coming out of World War II. There wasn't time to be elite during that time. So Tim Freeman was very much familiar with the real world. Another person like that was E.O. Lawrence, who built the first cyclotrons, and for whom Lawrence Livermore Lab is named. He was a rancher's son, and so he knew how to fix a barbed wire fence, and that came in very handy when he was making the first cyclotrons and things like that. So if you look at that generation of physicists, and other scientists, chemists, engineers, many of them came from rural backgrounds where they had to confront reality by themselves. There's no one to help. If you couldn't fix that fence, the cow got a house, right? And you had to do it. So this comes back to the lack of practical experience of young people today. If we could somehow fix that, it would make us a much stronger nation. But I'm wondering again. Yes, I've known a lot of people I respect. Freeman Dyson was a very close friend for many, many years, and I miss him a lot. And I knew Oppenheimer a little bit. I didn't like him very much, and but he had, had a hard life by the time I got to know him, and he had every right to be a little bit sour. And I have a number of Nobel Prize colleagues here in the Princeton faculty. One of my favorites, who I have tremendous respect for, is Joe Taylor, who, again, is a farm boy, but he discovered the binary pulsar, which was the first confirmation of gravitational waves. It was indirect, but it was still one of the best. How fast the pulsar damps down as it's rotating. And so he grew up on a farm, and he's a ham radio operator, and that turned out to be very useful, as a radio astronomer. But and he's still quite noted in the ham community. People I run into all over the world say, "Oh, you must know Joe Taylor, such and such a call number," right? So there are some really great people that I've been fortunate to know, and and I recommend that to anyone. If you know someone who you respect, get to know them, and you can learn a lot from them.
So haven't you had at least one student that went on to win a Nobel Prize?
Well, I guess John Clauser was my student. That's right. He would, he wasn't my graduate student, but he took my quantum mechanics course, and he got his prize. I must confess, I told him I thought this is not a very good topic to be working on. And in some sense, I was right. He didn't get tenure, but he did get the Nobel Prize. So John is a great guy.
Well, I've heard you talk elsewhere about this work you did about creating an artificial star to focus a laser in order for, I think it was for SDI, strategic defense.
That's
Do you think
right,
that
yeah.
is that the number one, in your view, your number one scientific achievement, or where's
Well, that's
that
certainly
rank?
what I'm most known for, yeah, or at least by people who know about that physics. I've done other things. I did a startup company on gas imaging of lungs, and but that's a much less much less widely known bit of work. Had a lot of help from good students, good postdocs, and all that. But yeah, the sodium guide star is probably what I'm best known for. You go to any big telescope, ground-based telescope today, at night you typically see this yellow sodium beam, or sometimes two or three, pointing up to the stars. And that's in order to measure the atmospheric turbulence for the ground-based telescope and allow them to see more clearly through the turbid atmosphere. The atmosphere is a little bit like a random lens, and if you measure its distortions, you can correct for that, and you can see much more clearly. But to do that, you have to have this artificial sodium star, unless you want to look at one of the 3 or 4 bright natural stars in the sky, but there are not very many of them, and it doesn't cover most of the sky.
But you did the calculations and drew this up on paper, and then they spent millions of dollars actually creating it and then flipped it on, and it worked first time up. Is that correct?
Yeah. This was a summer study in the first days of Star Wars, when we were looking at anything that might be used to stop an incoming missile. And naturally, one of the things we thought about was high power lasers, because even then you could make megawatt lasers that would melt just about anything, including nose cones. But the problem was getting it through the atmosphere with all that power onto the target, because if you send a high power atmosphere up toward a incoming missile, it breaks up into hundreds of subbeams by the time it reaches the missile. Even if it's a completely clear sky, doesn't work at all if there are clouds. But if it's a clear sky, it still doesn't work. And so the reason for these, they're called speckles, and these speckles are caused by the little patches of warm and cool air in the air path that the laser goes through. It retards it where the air is cold, and it lets the phase advance where it's warmer. But if you could measure those distortions, you could launch a laser beam that has a wrinkled wave before it goes into the atmosphere, and then the atmosphere undoes the wrinkle, and so it's called adaptive optics. And so people knew how to do that. I didn't invent the idea. That was invented by astronomers before me, and they had used it for a few bright stars, Sirius or Vega, the really bright stars. If you use those, there's enough light, you can correct the atmosphere in the direction of those bright stars. But most of the sky is too dark. And so my contribution was to say, well, you can make these artificial sodium stars in any direction, and then you can do that same correction, for the laser, so that when you shoot it, instead of breaking up into birdshot, it remains a high power rifle bullet when it hits the target. So that's the basics of it. There's a lot of complicated physics that's involved. But I guess the key thing was I knew there was a layer of sodium at 100 kilometers. By accident, I knew that. And I knew, how efficient sodium was at scattering light, and that you could probably get enough light if you use this layer. Unfortunately, the layer is everywhere. It's all over the whole Earth. It's made by the burning up of micrometeorites coming into the Earth's atmosphere as we orbit the sun. So you think of outer space as a vacuum, but it's really kind of dusty. And so that dust gets collected as we go through it in our orbit. And some of the dust is sodium. And it's those sodium atoms that are used for the star.
So as you talk about this, I can see why they describe your casual brilliance. People describe you that way. Yeah. So fantastic. What is there in your background, do you think, that led you to the point where you could get this stuff done? Is there things that, looking back, that helped you get to that point? Any people that influenced you, or education or experience, or what led you to where you got to be?
Well, I owe a lot to my mother, who was a chemist. And so and a doctor, she was a very good doctor. And so she got me interested in science at an early age. And she and I were together in Oak Ridge when I was just a toddler during the Manhattan Project. She went off to work during the day, and there was a caretaker who looked after me, because I was too young to go to school, but I knew what was going on. And so I think my mother was the biggest influence on me, and she was tragically killed in an auto accident, before she should have been. But at the very least, she helped to launch me into life, and I've often thought about her. I'm still grateful to her.
Let's see. Separate question here. I've had other people on this podcast who have argued that the greenhouse gas effect is zero. What is the number one observational piece of evidence that indicates that those people are incorrect?
Well, clouds are a little bit like greenhouse gases in that they hinder the escape of radiation to space. And so I think everyone knows that this time of year, if it's a cloudy day, you're unlikely to get frost. But if it's clear, you can say, kiss your tomatoes goodbye. And so anyone who's familiar with gardening knows that if you have frost or if very humid, that because of this greenhouse interception of radiation to space, the surface stays a lot warmer than if you've got clear skies. So a clear sky, a nice blue sky, dry, non-humid, it's got very little greenhouse effect compared to a humid sky or a cloudy sky. And we all see that, you don't need instruments, you don't need calculus to see that. So I just don't understand, why anyone would doubt the greenhouse effect. It's there. We should be grateful for it. CO2 doesn't make much difference to the greenhouse effect, or does methane or nitrous oxide, but to say there's no greenhouse effect is just not true.
Okay, very good. We're coming up to the end of our hour here. Any other points you'd like to make here? Whatever you'd like to say, let's go for it.
Well, I think one thing that would be helpful if we could get a little more science literacy in our country. And so, for goodness sakes, if you have a little extra time, do some serious thinking about science and mathematics. You don't have to learn very much to become a much more powerful judge of what's true and what's not. Stay as far as you can away from artificial intelligence. Use your own intelligence. If you do an artificial intelligence search, what you will get is the mainstream media propaganda, not the truth.
All right. I think we'll go ahead and wrap up there then. If you're okay with that?
Tom.
All right. Thanks a ton. This is so good. I really appreciate talking to you.
Well, thanks for all you do. Keep it up. Goodbye.
All right. Talk to you next time. Goodbye.
Okay.